There's a time in every gamer's life where one game comes along and it changes the entire outlook of video games for that said person. For me, this game was Resident Evil. What's up everybody, this is McStan and welcome back to the channel. For this video, I'm going to be discussing how Resident Evil changed my life forever and how I became the gamer that I am today. Now, before we get into it, I have to ask you, as always, to please hit that like button and definitely subscribe if you haven't already. Now, with all that out of the way, let's get straight into it. So I started playing video games around the late 90s, early 2000s. I was only about 5 or 6 years old at the time, and during this time, video games just weren't as popular as they are nowadays, so really I would spend most of my time actually playing outside. But when I did play video games, I would play games like Super Mario Bros. And of course sports games like Madden and WWF games. So these are very casual games. Of course, we didn't have games like Call of Duty back then, so these were the types of games that we would play just to pass the time. It wasn't until my parents bought me a copy of the first Resident Evil where I truly fell in love with video games, and I knew it was something that would be a part of the rest of my life. So you're probably wondering, why would my parents buy me a mature rated game at only 5 years old? Well, as a child, my family were huge horror fans. So me and my brother were really big fans of movies like Halloween and Friday the 13th, and my parents just thought, okay, let's give them a scary game to play because they like these scary movies so much. Well, as soon as I got this game, I was hooked. I was so scared to play Resident Evil. I was actually so scared, in fact, that I wouldn't even play it. I would actually force my dad to play it, and me and my brother would just watch him play it because we were way too scared to play this game. Now, the funny thing is, we were so scared of the first Resident Evil game, we never actually finished it. And we actually ended up getting Resident Evil 2. And this is the start of my love for video games. Resident Evil 2 is actually my favorite game of all time. And it's because it's the first game that really struck me to the core. I fell in love with the characters from this game. Leon is actually my favorite video game character ever. Resident Evil 2 is my favorite game of all time, probably because of the nostalgia and the deep meaning that this game has to me. This is actually the first game that I ever played from start to finish and actually completed. And I have beaten this game many times over the years. I've played it so many different ways, and this game is simply a masterpiece in my opinion. Now, what made this game different than Resident Evil 1 was the fact that it had a mode, or an easy mode rather, that made the game easier for me as a kid to get over my fears of the game. So, unlike Resident Evil 1, which was way too scary for me to actually finish, Resident Evil 2, while being just as scary, had an easy mode in the game that made it easier for me to play and made me want to keep coming back. So with that being said, Resident Evil 2 is a really special game to me. And playing Resident Evil 2 so much made me want to go back to Resident Evil 1. Unfortunately, it took years for me to get back to that game because it was hard to find a copy of Resident Evil 1 that wasn't damaged. For some reason, all the copies that I would come across as a kid when I would go to GameStop or EB Games all had deep scratches on them and just would not play. So it took me years to finally play Resident Evil 1 again. But I did happen to come across another game in Resident Evil 3. And just like Resident Evil 2, Resident Evil 3 is another one of those games that hold a special place in my heart. This game brought me so much enjoyment as a child, and it introduced some characters that I still love today, like Jill Valentine and the Nemesis. These two characters are so iconic. Another thing about this game that I really enjoyed was the fact that I was able to backtrack to locations from Resident Evil 2. So this game really just was amazing to me, and it only furthered my interest in the Resident Evil series. So after playing RE2 and RE3 countless times, I was hooked on the series. I wanted more and more Resident Evil, and of course, I still could not find that copy of Resident Evil 1 that I've been searching for a very long time. With that being said, Capcom kept releasing new Resident Evil titles over the years. Like Code Veronica, this game was so good. It was the first game that actually brought action into Resident Evil. And just like the other two Resident Evil games, Code Veronica furthered my interest in the series even more. And luckily, Capcom kept the Resident Evil games coming. So I started playing games like Resident Evil Outbreak and Outbreak File 2. These two games are actually some of my favorite Resident Evil games ever. And if I had to choose for any Resident Evil game to get a remake, I'm picking Outbreak over any Resident Evil game, hands down. Also, if you haven't noticed, the background music I'm playing during this video is the Resident Evil Outbreak theme. So of course there were other Resident Evil games during this time, but honestly, they weren't that good, so we're not going to talk about them. But what I am going to talk about is none other than Resident Evil 4. This game literally changed gaming as we know it. If it wasn't for Resident Evil 4, many other games that we play now wouldn't have even been created. This game is a trendsetter. This game revolutionized video gaming as we know it, and honestly, I just feel so lucky to be a part of the time that this game came out. The first time I ever played Resident Evil 4, I simply was blown away. And I know most of you were probably too young for the release of Resident Evil 4, and you probably don't remember the impact it had on the world. But when Resident Evil 4 released, it changed everything. There was nothing like Resident Evil 4 before it was released. The game looked so good. It felt so good. The tension, everything about this game, the gore effects. I cannot tell you how amazing it felt to play this game for the first time. I was blown away. I remember playing this game and just thinking in my head, whoa. Games are never going to be the same. This is the future of video games. And boy, was I right. This game literally is one of the greatest games ever created. Now, I know it might not hold up in today's gaming market, but really think about that. Have you ever played a game that you just play and you're like, oh my god, this game is so good. I can't believe that this exists. That's literally what Resident Evil 4 was. I'm not sugarcoating it. I'm not over-exaggerating. That's exactly what Resident Evil 4 was. And while Resident Evil 4 may not be my favorite Resident Evil game, or it may not even be the best Resident Evil game, Resident Evil 4 gave me a feeling that none of these other games have even come close to. And when I look back on it, I can't believe how big this game was, and I can't believe how it changed video games forever. And I feel so lucky to be able to be a part of this era of gaming that literally shaped video games forever. Now, with all that being said, Resident Evil 4 was not the end of Resident Evil. And after playing Resident Evil 4 countless times, like all the other Resident Evil games, I wanted more Resident Evil, so I continued my journey with the newer Resident Evil games. And unfortunately, these newer Resident Evil games just were not as good as Resident Evil 1 through 4. And it really bummed me out, because although I did enjoy them, they just did not give me that same feeling that I got from these older Resident Evil titles. And for the longest time, I was thinking that Resident Evil as a series was dead. Until Resident Evil 7 released. finally, after waiting years and years for a decent Resident Evil game, Resident Evil 7 came around and it went back to the horror roots that originally made me a fan of the series. Now, of course, Resident Evil 7 was very different than the original Resident Evil games, but it felt familiar and it felt very, very good. And for the first time, Resident Evil actually felt like Resident Evil again, and it was a huge relief. I felt like Resident Evil was actually being revived, because for the longest time, all these action Resident Evil games that were released just made me feel like they didn't know what the fans wanted. We want horror in our Resident Evil games. We don't want action. If I wanted an action game, I'd play something else. And I think that was the huge problem with Resident Evil at the time. They were just trying to capitalize on games like Call of Duty and other games of that sort. So they brought us Resident Evil 7. They went back to the horror roots. The game did phenomenal. It brought so many eyes onto Resident Evil as a series again, and many people started playing the older games again. And this made Capcom realize, okay, we can capitalize on this. Let's start remaking these older Resident Evil games. And that's what they did. They announced that they were remaking Resident Evil 2, and as you know, Resident Evil 2 is my favorite game of all time. So you know I was excited for this. Now when the game finally released, I thought it was fantastic. It brought back so much nostalgia because it had so many elements of the original Resident Evil 2 in it, but with a modern twist. Now, in my opinion, I still prefer the original because there were just some things that were left out of the original, but RE2 Remake is a very good game, and I think it's the best modern Resident Evil title we've had so far. And at the time of me recording this video, Resident Evil 4 Remake hasn't released yet, so maybe that might become the best modern Resident Evil game, but right now it's Resident Evil 2. Then we got Resident Evil 3 Remake, which was a huge downgrade from Resident Evil 2. The game felt very rushed, and although it was still mechanically a very good game, it just wasn't that good of a game when you compare it to RE2 Remake or even the original Resident Evil 3. It really was lacking many things, and it just felt really rushed. But then we got Resident Evil Village, another first-person Resident Evil game, and this game actually felt really good, and this game actually was really good. I really did enjoy playing Village, and although I don't think it's as good as Resident Evil 7, this game actually took the internet by storm and became very, very popular on social media. With that being said, it was a very good game, and I love the fact that it actually tied the series to its very beginning. And after I finished Resident Evil Village and I played the DLC Shadows of Rose, all it did was make me want more Resident Evil. So when I look to the future of Resident Evil, I have very high hopes for this series. And in that regard, Resident Evil is just a very special series to me. It's very near and dear to my heart, and it literally has changed my life. Without Resident Evil, my whole outlook on video games, or even pop culture, would be very different. And it goes back to my parents buying a 5-year-old kid a really scary game that I happened to fall in love with. Anyway, I hope you guys did enjoy this video. I would love to hear in the comments section if there is any game that you have played that had the same effect on you that Resident Evil had on me. I would definitely love to hear it, so sound off below. And as always, thank you so much for watching. I really hope you guys enjoyed this video, and I will catch you in the next one.